I never imagined that a simple dance with a CEO would lead to a heartbreaking turnaround in my life. The hotel doors were heavier than the invitation suggested. They swung inward on brass hinges that sighed like someone who'd heard every version of a story 1,000 times and had grown bored of the new ones. Outside, the evening air smelled faintly of sea salt and diesel, an inland clinging to the coast. And inside, through the glass, the lobby looked like a painting, warm light pooling on marble, a string quartet rehearsing the kind of song people put behind engagement photos. I had $20 in my pocket and a dress borrowed from a thrift store hung on me like a promise. My cousin had called in a rush 3 days earlier, voice sharp with embarrassment and the kind of urgency reserved for things someone didn't want anyone else to witness. "Come," she had said, "just for a little while, please." I told myself I would be a quiet shadow in the corner, leave before the cake, be interstate stupid and not bother anyone. I told myself that because it sounded responsible. It sounded smaller and therefore safer. The doorman didn't buy any of it. He didn't look at my face or at the tiny heirloom book pendant that swung against my sternum. He looked at the envelope in my hand, the thin cardstock with a name not mine, and with a kindness that felt like a judgment, he said, "This isn't your table, ma'am." People imagine humiliation as one sharp blow, a spotlight, a spilled drink, laughter. That night, there were pinpricks, the hiss of a cigarette outside, a server's eyebrow lift as he passed with champagne, the way the valet's smile shut off. A group of women in silk had a laugh that moved across the foyer like a breeze, and I felt it lift the hem of my dress and expose me. I thought of my mother, the way she would find a way to explain away expense, how she used to fold hope into envelopes and pretend they'd arrived on time. My chest ached with a small domestic grief, the kind that isn't worthy of a headline. I was turning away when someone said my name. "Emily?" His voice was quiet against the hum, exactly the kind of voice that made people turn without thinking. He had the kind of presence that didn't scream wealth, it simply fit the room like a missing piece. Tall, tidy, a suit that suggested money but kept its mouth shut about it. He had a look of being used to getting what he wanted without needing to ask loudly, an economy of motion that made being around him brief and decisive. "Mr. Bennett," my cousin had called him earlier in a tone that mixed worship and calculation. He was the company that sponsored the building's lights. He was the man people put in magazine spreads next to yachts and quotes about leadership. Up close, he was less a magazine cutout and more a person who'd been taught how to divide himself into private and then had only ever lived in public. He stepped between me and the doorman as if he were rearranging two pieces of furniture. His hand touched the small of my arm, just a pilot easing someone through a cabin, and the doorman, practical and undefeated, made room. "Emily Hart," he said, as if reading from a list, but not as a performative pronunciation, more like recognition. "My sister-in-law just told me there's a runaway bridesmaid situation. Mind if I escort you inside?" I should have said no. I should have said I didn't want trouble, that I didn't want a scene. Instead, I let his hand guide me into the ballroom where the lights pulled in honeyed discs and people moved like practiced constellations. The quartet leaned into song. The first note slid over me like a silk veil. "You're not supposed to be here," I wanted to tell him. I wanted to explain how my family had folded under numbers that refused to add up, how invitations now came with a price tag and an asterisk. I wanted to tell him about the nights my mother pressed a coin into my palm and said, "Keep it for emergencies," until emergency became the shape of my life. Instead, he offered his hand. "May?" he asked. There are moments that feel like beginning, even if they are not. His palm was cool, calloused at the base of the fingers where work meets restraint. When a stranger with the air of a public man asks you to dance, it is a social transaction, a favor, a cover, a bit of theater. I had practiced being small my whole life. I had perfected the art of not being seen. Taking his hand felt shaky and dangerously clean. We moved into the crowd, and the music waltzed slow and forgiving. The lights caught in his jaw and softened him. For a few measures, the room receded. The warmth of his body, the way his shoulder blade fit against my palm, the steady, glad rhythm of his pulse beneath silk. These things made a place inside my chest feel fuller than it had in months. The world narrowed to the sound of bows on strings and the press of fabric. "You look like you belong," he said into the hollow between notes. It could have been flattery, a practiced line to cradle an awkward evening, but the way he said it held no patronizing curl. It was plain, honest. "Do you?" he asked afterward, softer. I did not know how to answer. I had spent most of my life making do, making small, and being grateful for the threadbare things that still held. I started, and then the room found us again. A ripple of whispering moved through the crowd like a draft. Someone laughed politely in the corner, and the sound carried antiseptic judgment. The bride arrived like a clause in a contract, immaculate, luminous, and with an entourage that seemed to produce its own atmosphere. Lauren moved through the room with a careful smile, a smile that had been wired by generations to be precise and cold as crystal. Her eyes settled on us like a verdict. I had only been present for a handful of minutes, and already I felt like an exhibit. A woman at the next table leaned in and tilted her chin, as if to get a better look at the failure or the joke. A man at the bar, his tie lax, lifted his drink and angled it for a better view. Someone murmured the name of the company Jake led, and the tone of it was worshipful. It made my own smallness loud. "Who invited you?" Lauren's voice was spare but sharp as a broken glass, and everyone paused in the way one pauses for a dropped item. "It appears she wasn't on the list," someone whispered. "How does she get in?" The hush made my ears ring. I felt sick and ridiculous, like a child being exposed for a lie. I wanted to sink into the floor and hide under the grown people's shoes. My fingers tightened on Jake's sleeve without conscious thought. He did something then that surprised me more than the hush. He did not smile. He did not smooth over the moment with a public joke, the kind men like him often use to diffuse aristocratic awkwardness. He did not usher me away or pretend I'd been a joke he couldn't remember playing. He took me by the hand and led me back onto the floor. "She's with me," he said. The quartet's second violin tripled the breath the room took in. "Now, if anyone has a problem with our choice of company, they'll have to take it up with me." People like to think that the rich are always performing. The truth is more complicated. Some of them are terrified of scandal, of unscripted human mess, because their image is the currency for everything else they buy. Jake's hand tightened, but his voice held an unbruised kindness that did not plead or bargain. It felt like an anchor. That was the first time I saw the line between what people expected him to be and what he was when he chose not to be performative. He wasn't saving me so much as insisting I existed. If the dance was the beginning, the moment after it was the test. We drifted from the center of the room, and in a cluster of light there was a small envelope lying like a splinter on a table. My curiosity is a stubborn thing. It is the only trait in me that has never been tamed by lack. The card had my name written in a hand that was careful and cruel. "You will never belong here." I remember the way the words hung in the air, ugly, certain. For a second I could not breathe. Someone had folded contempt into folded paper and sent it through the world. The room's warmth contracted to a pinprick inside my ribs. "Who would do?" I started, but the sentence collapsed into something private and ragged. Jake looked at the card and then at me. He made a motion with his jaw I would later learn was one of those small private things he did when decisions formed inside him like storms. Then he did something quietly theatrical. He tore the note in half and tucked the pieces under his shoe. "Does that belong to you?" he asked. There was no faux chivalry in it. It was a simple question asked to a person someone had tried to expel. No. I had been careful to speak only truth in those rooms where lineage and money could be used to unthread you. The admission came out thin and real. He sat with me on a little settee by the window that looked out on the hotel's private terrace. Outside, the ocean was a black sheet with little pinpricks of light. Inside, everything had the smell of lemon oil and wealth. "You shouldn't have to explain why your family falls apart," he said. "People have histories that are messy, Emily. That doesn't mean they don't have value." I laughed then because the alternative was to cry, and I did not yet want my face to belong to the night. "I'm not used to people saying that who don't need anything from me." "Maybe that's because they often are needing something," he replied. "I don't expect anything." We spoke in fits and starts. I learned small things about him that evening. His favorite books, the fact that he hated public speaking unless the topic was numbers, that he played piano badly but with earnestness, that he had appointed people in his company who shared only his title, not his moral patience. When he laughed, there was a softness that didn't match the press photos. "Why did you help me?" I asked at one point, and it felt like I was asking a child why the moon stayed up at night. "Because I could," he said simply, "and because you looked like someone who needed a hand." There was honesty in it that had nothing to do with heroics. It was more like the quiet rightness of holding an umbrella over a stranger when rain starts. Later, under the hotel's old lanterns that threw soft honey on everything, we walked out onto the terrace. The city made a slow, glittering story below us. He stopped and turned, and the air was the kind that makes people feel like they're being held on the very edge of confession. "You're not afraid to be seen tonight," he said, because he had watched me try to be small. Most people who have to hide from their families don't have the courage to walk into a room and stand where everyone could point. The wind pulled at the edges of my borrowed dress and made my hair loosen in the way that makes people look more human. I thought of 100 mornings where I'd tucked my own bravery into a drawer and zipped it shut. I had to be somewhere, I admitted. Someone had to know I existed. "Sometimes people think they can buy their way into not being lonely," he said. "But the truth is, we make choices that break loneliness in small ways. Showing up, saying the awkward thing, lending a hand without the expectation of applause." He looked at me then as if weighing those words against some personal ledger. There was a softness in his eyes I hadn't seen earlier in the night, an inkling of exhaustion. He was a man who'd built walls between the private and the public with care. When the private allowed itself into a public space with me standing slightly crooked in it, his expression shifted to something very human, a longing and a fear stitched together. He kissed me then, not in a grand cinematic way, but in a hush. It was the kind of kiss that is brave because it is honest, the kind that asks permission and then accepts the answer. It tasted faintly of coffee and a life I hadn't known. We stayed in that softness for a moment so fragile it could have broken like glass. After that night, the world seemed to do what it does best: pull you back into its routine and make you prove every humane claim you felt. People talked. The word spread that the CEO had danced with an uninvited guest. The local blogs loved a spectacle. The sensationalism was almost routine in its cruelty. Headlines always need a body to hang on, and I had offered mine. The first week after the wedding, there were columns that tried to place me, worth a photo, an economy story, a cautionary tale, and then there were others that looked for a moral, an angle, a way to measure the degree to which someone like me could be allowed to exist in rooms where people like Lauren breathed expensive air. I imagined headlines that suggested I had been a plant, a publicity stunt, a mistake in the CEO's calendar. I imagined gossip that placed me at the center of a calculated strategy. The world is lazy that way. It prefers stories where the poor are careful inventions rather than accidentals with dignity. For a short time, Jake weathered the petty storms with quiet, patient statements. "She's a person," he said once in an interview, as if telling the press to remember that a person existed beyond the photograph. The words, small and precise, like his hands, gave me a kind of privacy I didn't know how to have. For the first time in years, I felt less visible and more seen. There were other reasons for his attention. The company he led, Bennett & Co., was slated for a major acquisition. There were late-night board meetings, spreadsheets that tasted of oil, and a rumor of hostile investors. I saw him more in the background then, sleep-deprived, at times startled by the volume of his own life. He'd been trained to be decisive, to weather storms with a poker face. But the public admiration that cushioned many of his choices also made the shocks louder. If the night of the wedding had shown me he could choose gentleness, the week that followed revealed how tethered his gentleness was to public consequence. People applauded that he had danced with a woman who wore a thrifted dress, and then, with the speed of attention, they looked for cost. One Tuesday morning, I arrived at a cafe to meet him. We'd decided to exchange books, something he had suggested at the wedding and that, inexplicably, made me feel like a person with a future rather than a person with a past. He was waiting with a paperback in his hand and a coffee that had grown tepid. "I need to apologize," he said nearly at once. His voice had a tightness that had nothing to do with contrition and everything to do with a fast-moving decision being born. He set his cup down and looked over the rim of it, as if the line of the cup could divide private issues from the world. "I think my board's going to make a fuss about the optics," he said. "They're worried the press will use this to skew people toward narratives we don't want." I blanked. "Narratives?" "Rumors," he said. "Sensitivity to perception." He hesitated. "I can't—" He paused, searching for a phrase that would be honest and not brutal. "I can't have you caught in that crossfire." The crossfire. The words landed and folded over my chest like a hand. "I don't understand," I said. I wanted to be clear-headed and fair. I wanted to let logic have the room. "If you care about me, why would you?" He put a palm on mine, a small, slow motion. "This is not you to carry," he said. I thought I could shield that from happening, but the more time I spend trying to manage every angle, the more I see the risk. There are people who think a relationship like ours would be weaponized by competitors. They will twist anything they can to destabilize a deal. I can't risk that for the company. I can't risk it for you. The sentence was folded in all the ways power can wrap kindness so tightly it becomes suffocation. I understood the arithmetic of it, boardroom versus life, how one must sometimes make decisions that chain and straighten the heart. But understanding a thing didn't mean it stopped hurting. "Then tell me," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Tell me you have to go away to protect me. Don't tell me you're abandoning me. Let there be a reason." He looked at me then with a kind of apology that surprised me. "I will go away. I will step back, publicly. But it's to keep your name unpulled across headlines and to protect the company. I can't be the cause of trouble for you." Those words sounded noble in a press release. In my chest, they were a clean fracture. How do you react to a man who says he'll cut the rope for your safety and then cuts it? How do you respond to a sacrifice that leaves rawness where warmth once was? He left that evening with the excuse of immediate travel. He said he would call. He said board meetings might tie him up for a little while. He pressed his fingers against my knuckles like a benediction, and then he was gone, threading through lobby crowds like an actor exiting a stage. At first, I believed him. I read his public statements, where he emphasized securing the company's long-term interests, his words measured and curated. For a long week, I told myself he was doing the gentlemanly thing, bearing the burden so I could have my life, as small as it was, preserved. I imagined him in boardrooms, wallet of a man whose private life became collateral, speaking on numbers, on mergers, on stability. But then the board statements grew less general and more pointed. There was a call for focus. There were sudden departures at executive levels that seemed to correlate with the story that had framed us. A financial blogger with a vindictive streak suggested that the CEO's vulnerability made the company weak. The headlines compounded, and with the weight of public perception came pressure. One afternoon, I was walking home with my book pendant warm against my neck when I saw my face in an online article, cropped, captioned, and framed beside a headline accusing me, thinly veiled. Distraction? The caption used the words opportunistic and calculated, as if motives were easily legible in the way a celebrity favors a certain tie. The article suggested I had used the wedding for access, and the comments were cruel in that predictable, expert way where anonymous people felt licensed to reshape humanity into caricature. My phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number with a short, simple text. "We can do this for the company, Emily. You need to step out." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. I called Jake. It went straight to voicemail. I messaged him. It read, and then nothing. I left him a voicemail that was probably too brittle and too honest. "If you're doing this to protect me, tell me. Don't leave me adrift." Later that evening, a mutual acquaintance sent me a photo. It was a still from a shareholders' meeting, one in which Jake's face looked pinched and tired. The image was accompanied by a press release that spoke of leadership focus and strategic discretion. It felt like a wedge driven into my chest. When he eventually replied, his words were careful, the kind of clarity that respects the need for distance but does not ease the lonely place it leaves behind. He said he'd stepped down from attending some public events and would be out of town for meetings that may last longer than expected. He said it was temporary. He said it was necessary. He thanked me for understanding. I read the message until it made lines on my palm, until I was so familiar with its folds I could have recited it in the night. But texts can be polished. They are small public statements. They are not soft, warm hands. After that, the world did as it does when it finds an unmoored story. It created a narrative that was easier to digest than nuance. Friends began to fall away, as though they had been briefly enthusiastic about an illusion and now were embarrassed to admit they'd been fooled. My cousin apologized with the smallness of someone whose family etiquette had been shaped by the fear of gossip. Lauren never called. The invitation stopped altogether. On my kitchen counter, I kept the torn piece of paper from the wedding tucked under a coffee mug. It had begun as contempt and then became a relic. Every so often, I would look at it and remind myself that someone had tried to define me in ink and failed. Failed because I was still here, still breathing, still alive. Then, about 3 weeks after the wedding, something else arrived. A plain email from a small foundation that offered services to people trying to rebuild. There was a note at the bottom mentioning a new initiative for community literature programs, a chance for a communications coordinator to help run outreach. The job was modestly paid, local, and exactly the sort of thing my college professors would have said suits someone who knows how to make words matter. There was a contact at the bottom, a name. I clicked and saw that the sender's email belonged to a charity connected to Bennett & Co.'s foundation arm. It was not a message directly from him. It was a formal offer, typed and sincere. My first impulse was to refuse. Accepting anything tied to him felt like barter. But then I put the book pendant in my palm and thought about small economies. How sometimes shelter arrives behind a company's imprimatur, and sometimes that shelter is the only step you need to get your footing. I thought about the nights my mother had held bottles and boxes and told stories that kept us alive. I thought about showing up and the courage it sometimes took. I took the call. Emily Hart, the voice said on the other end, warm and professional. "We'd love to invite you to lead a community reading project. Your experience and your voice would be valuable." It was ordinary, bureaucratic, and for some reason, what ordinary had in it felt like a promise. I accepted. Not because it was him or because I needed to be near his orbit, but because it offered a way to exist in the world on terms I could measure and control. It was the kind of small agency I'd been saving up for years. And then the heartbreak unfolded in the way small things gather into a kind of avalanche. Jake sent a formal note that week to the press explaining his temporary focus on company affairs, and, in the same breath, announced a restructuring that would see him travel extensively and take on certain advisory roles performed from abroad. There was an image of a man on a plane, and my face as a footnote in articles that hinted at distraction and bad timing. One morning, several weeks after the wedding, an image circulated on social media. Jake at a gala in Geneva, smiling in a tux, standing beside dignitaries with whom I'd never shared a table. The picture should not have hurt. The night had been months ago. But the image felt like a clean erasure, a finality. It suggested a life that had moved on from the soft, private corners we'd inhabited on the terrace. I stared at the photograph and felt my chest hollow out. I went to bed thinking the pain would be gone by morning. It wasn't. The next day, a local journalist sent a message with a question phrased as an opportunity. "Would you comment on your relationship with Mr. Bennett?" There are readers who want to know the human side of corporate leaders. My reply was honest and braced. "We had something private. I will not comment." The reporter wrote back, "Are you sure? Public interest is high." I thought about the sale of my mother's life and how she had taught me to value privacy. I thought about the torn invitation and how someone had tried to define me in a single sentence. I decided at last to speak in a way that did not hand my grief to strangers. I sent an email to the foundation contact asking for clarity about the job's terms and about how the organization protected its stories from the public glare. The reply was swift and kindly. "We would be honored to have you. Your experience matters. We appreciate discretion. We'll do everything we can to support you in this." There it was, an offer of ordinary dignity. I accepted on a tiny, steady key of hope. Then, 2 days later, when I was packing an old sweater into a box to move into a slightly larger apartment I could finally afford because of the job, my phone buzzed. A number flagged as private. I thought for a moment it might be him, a soft apology, a small human voice. Instead, the voice on the line was clipped and unfamiliar. "Miss Hart," a woman said, "this is Miss Claiborne from Bennett & Co.'s legal office. Please do not contact Mr. Bennett again. Any further attempts to reach him will be considered harassment." The line went dead. I stood in the middle of my living room with a box of sweaters, and the word harassment turned over in my mouth. The legalese felt like a lock clicking into place. It wasn't tender, it wasn't thoughtful. It was procedural and precise. There are protean ways people say goodbye. Silence is one, bureaucracy is another. That afternoon is etched into me, not for any one moment, but for the way all these small, standard things conspired to make a clean erasure of the tenderness we'd shared. It was as if a corporate map had been unfurled, and in the margins my name had been smudged out. I will not romanticize the next weeks. I did not ride into triumph on a horse. I cried sometimes in the small, private rooms of my life, in the shower, on the subway, in the back of a bookstore aisle where the smell of paper made my head clear. But I also acted. I took the communications role. The first day, the office felt like a field I could walk through in my own 2 feet instead of being carried. There was coffee. There were new people who held their own small loneliness like I did. There were hours of work and the comforting rhythm of a task completed. In the months that followed, the foundation's outreach became the place I folded my days into something useful. We set up book drives in neighborhoods where libraries had crumbled. We made space for readings for people who'd never had a microphone. I found solace in helping others tell their stories. The work was honest and incremental. It didn't cure the ache of being left, but it taught me how to stand up under it. Every so often, someone would post a photograph of Jake at an event. Sometimes there were captions that spoke of moving forward and strong leadership. Once in a while, a friend would find my face on the internet and call to say, "Do you want me to take care of this?" And I would say, "No," meaning both, "No, don't shield me," and "No, I will do this myself." I kept the torn piece of paper under my coffee mug. I kept the book pendant, a circle of metal with a tiny engraved spine, close to my pulse. It was small and private and stubborn, and it reminded me of a truth. Things are rarely erased by a press release or a suit. The people who are kind to you, who take your hand and spin you into the center of a room, stay somewhere inside the architecture of your life, even if they leave the stage. There was a photograph on my wall. One night at the wedding, a friend had snapped of me and he, framed by a lantern's glow. I had kept a copy in the bottom drawer of my desk as if to remind myself that warmth had visited me and I had allowed it. When the legal note arrived, I nearly tucked that photograph away too, afraid it would be evidence if the world ever decided to accuse me. Instead, I moved it to my desk where I saw it when drafting newsletters and campaign ideas. It was not about nostalgia. It was about permission to remember that tender things had happened to me and were still true. Then, about 5 months later, a letter arrived in the mail with no return address. It consisted of one folded page. Inside were 3 sentences written in his hand. "Emily," it began, "I am sorry for how I left things. I thought I was protecting you. I see now the hurt that caused. My absence was cowardice dressed as protection. If there is ever a way I can make it right, I will try. Jake." I read the note at the kitchen table and felt a small opening inside me that didn't heal the wound but made it possible to see light through a crack. The note did not come as a rescue. It came as an acknowledgement. There is a difference between those two things. That could have been the end of the story, the neat line of accountability without a grand gesture. A man admits he was wrong, a woman heals in the slow, steady way life allows. But life rarely ends in a single line, and stories are not tidy. When someone who had been a brief constellation in my life admitted fault, it did not erase the months of quiet and the nights where I woke with the shape of his absence pressed into my ribs. It did not shrink the way people had shared their opinions about my motives or take back the legal language that had yanked me into the margins. The sad part of heartbreak is not always the pain itself. It's the way you must rebuild after it has rearranged the furniture inside you. It teaches you how to work with broken things, how to make a shelf out of splinters, how to make a life that is not entirely defined by a person who once touched your hand during a song. On a cool autumn morning, not long after the letter arrived, I stood in front of a community center where our new literacy program was launching. Children shuffled in with mismatched coats. A woman named Rosa, who ran the after-school program, smiled like a person who had been cobbled into kindness. The event was small and human and honest. I gave a short speech about the power of being seen. It felt performative and also deeply real. Afterwards, someone approached me, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a badge that said volunteer, and held up a torn piece of paper. "I thought you might want this back," he said. "It was found near the wedding venue. Someone threw it out in the trash. Figured you might like it." It was my torn note, the one Jake had ripped in half and tucked under his shoe. I held the paper with a careful reverence and noticed, for the first time, a small greasy smudge at the corner where he'd set his foot over it. The smudge felt like a reluctance to be cruel, an old human hesitation. I kept it. There is a part of heartbreak that insists on being useful. It doesn't allow you to be entirely ruined. It encourages small decisions that add up, to accept a modest job that feeds you, to show up in a room, to hold a child's hand while she reads aloud and marvels at the word adventure like it's a new country. And then there was the day an email came with a photograph attached. Jake in a boardroom, hands on the table, looking tired but resolved. The caption was short, back to focus. There was no flourish, no plea. There was a businesslike tone to it that made the heart clench with memory. I read it and then put the phone down. I wasn't sure what I expected. I had lived through the cruel swing of being made a spectacle and then erased. I had lived through kindness and the ache of absence. I had taken a job that had nothing to do with his world and everything to do with mine. If there is a cruel irony to my story, it's that sometimes the very act of being seen, danced with under a chandelier by a man everyone admired, can fracture into the most private sort of loneliness. He had been an island of gentleness in a room full of public fog, and when he retreated behind his public obligations, I found myself on the shoreline again, watching. That is not the end. It is only a begin thing, a starting point for a life that would reconfigure itself around new work, new friends, a new sense of purpose. It's where I learned to stand at a table and declare, quietly but with a pulse, that I belonged. On my desk, under the lamp that hummed softly, I kept the photograph of us by the lantern, the torn note, the book pendant. They were relics indeed, but relics of things that were true. A dance happened. I was seen.
Then a heartbreak came and shifted everything. I would not let it be the last chapter of my story. But stories, especially the ones that involve people with power and people who have been left, are seldom contained within a single season. The next chapter would require harder labor. It would demand that I choose between clinging to a memory and forging a life that refused to be defined by absence. It would ask that I take small acts of kindness and turn them into a steady architecture of belonging that did not require anyone to validate me. As autumn turned to winter, the city grew barer and the evenings colder. The foundation's calendar filled with events. I found myself speaking in rooms filled with people who had known only the bluntness of shortage. Sometimes, late at night, I would take the photograph from the drawer and look at it and think of the way music had softened everything, even if only for a song or two. One particular evening, as snow started to settle on the hotel's awning where once I'd stood with $20 in a borrowed dress, I took the photograph and leaned it against the lamp. I wasn't sure whether I was nursing a hope or a wound, perhaps both. Perhaps that's how most beginnings feel. Two things braided together. There are other things I didn't mention. The way Lauren's apology, months later, arrived by text and then disappeared when I ignored it. The way the community rallied around our program and donated books with notes tucked inside them. The way my mother called less often, then more, as if those calls were a slow repair. The way the necklace sometimes caught the light and made me think of that one perfect angle where even sorrow looked like gold. He had intervened in my life for a night, and then, in a way that felt like betrayal and also like self-preservation, retreated. It broke me in a way that taught me how to rebuild. The dance was the hinge. The heartbreak was the slow, awkward kind that doesn't announce itself like a thunderclap, but arrives as 100 small doors clicking shut. It was the way ordinary days suddenly had new edges, a voicemail that never returned, a social feed that erased our laughter, a legal edict that made kindness feel like trespass. The dance was the hinge. The heartbreak was the quiet after it swung. I kept working. It was less a decision than a sequence of small, stubborn acts. Showing up to the office, learning to run a donor list, drafting a press note that didn't sound like I needed defending. My days filled with names of schools that smelled of bleach and possibility, with volunteers whose faces were generous and worn. Those who came to our reading circles arrived with half smiles and whole stories. They did not know the contour of my life prior to the foundation. They only knew the voice at the front of the room that said, "Let's read this together." Every now and then, in the margin of an otherwise ordinary hour, I would pull the photograph of the two of us under the lantern from the drawer and hold it up to the light. There we were. The silk of his sleeve, the soft shadow of the lamp, my grin that didn't know it would be cataloged and commented on. Objects are strange repositories. They keep memory like a museum keeps artifacts, flat and honest. I kept the torn edge of the invitation tucked into my wallet like a talisman that said, "You were handed cruelty and you didn't fold." There were days when I wanted to let the wound define me. The legal letter had a way of making certain things official. It read like an ultimatum and felt, for a time, like a verdict. But grief has muscles if you use them. It isn't only a thing that breaks you. If you use those muscles, you learn to lift a life in pieces and set it upon a table again. The early months were practical. Training volunteers, sketching a curriculum for after-school programs, cajoling a grant committee into believing that literacy could be a form of social medicine. I learned to write grant language that had no glamour but lots of teeth. I found a rhythm in the small ceremonial things, making sign-in sheets, folding program booklets, standing in front of a crowd of 12-year-olds who'd never held a new book before and reading aloud until their mouths found the rhythm of the sentences. And yet there were moments, little fissures, where his absence was sharp. A friend would forward an image of Jake on a business trip, smiling beside a foreign minister, and for a beat my chest would feel like a room with no windows. I found myself measuring time not in calendar weeks, but by the number of times my phone buzzed with a headline. Sometimes I wanted the world to know that kindness had been given and then withdrawn. Other times I craved silence, a hum beneath the noise where I could put my life back together away from a crowd who needed scandal to feel alive. I am not proud of how often I checked the small mailbox on my desk, nor of the number of times I walked past the legal department's number and imagined it ringing with a human voice that wasn't clipped by corporate protocol. There is a strange loneliness to being told your presence threatens someone else's work. It teaches you the bitter arithmetic of power. He wrote again only once before the handwritten note, an email with the subject line, "For Emily." It said little. It spoke with corporate restraint about unfortunate publicity and necessary focus. The formality of it hollowed me out. Then, weeks later, his 3-sentence letter arrived, the one I kept on the kitchen table and read until the ink blurred at the edges. He confessed to a cowardice dressed as protection. He owned a sequence of errors that had left me exposed. Those words were not a salve. They were a start. There is a difference between regret and repair. Regret can be expressed in a line. Repair requires labor and evidence. He seemed to understand that eventually, because the next things I heard about him were not statements of lonely remorse delivered with dramatic punctuation, but a set of quiet administrative shocks. I watched from a distance as he began to make difficult choices that were not stage-managed press moves, but hard corporate surgery. He recused himself from certain negotiations, pushed for a separation between the foundation's governance and the company's public relations, insisted on an audit of how our stories were used in marketing materials. There were costs for him: boardroom infighting, a temporary stock wobble, the kind of humiliation that has a price in quarterly reports. I watched these decisions float through headlines and felt something unfamiliar, the stirrings of justice. It would be dishonest to say he returned overnight. The reunion came with breadcrumbs, an email asking how the program had adapted, a cordial message about a new grant being considered by a restructured committee, and then, months after the wedding, a call from his assistant asking if I would meet with a representative from Bennett & Co.'s foundation. I almost said no. I wanted to be stubborn in the good way, steadfastly mine. When we met, it was in a downtown conference room rather than on a terrace under lanterns, which should have made it less cinematic and therefore less risky. He had not appeared in a photo in months without a neutral backdrop. He had been quieter in the press. He greeted me with a small nod and a hand offered without drama.
We sat across from each other, and the air smelled of coffee and paper, not postures. I asked them to come, he said, meaning his people, meaning the stewarding kind that has to happen when someone with influence tries to repair harm. I wasn't sure you'd respond to me directly. I don't owe you a response, I said, because sometimes truths demand air. But I came because the work matters. He listened. He told me plainly about the pressure he felt to be two people at once. The CEO the market demanded, and the man who wanted his life to be less of a ledger. He spoke of conversations where he had chosen the safe sounding board and how each choice had compounded the injury. There was no melodramatic unraveling, only an adult owning a string of decisions that had consequences. "How do you make it right?" I asked finally, the question heavy and blunt. He pushed a folder across the table. Inside were excerpts from revised governance documents, letters of commitment to community partners, and a redacted legal memo showing he had voluntarily submitted to third-party oversight of any philanthropic ventures touching the foundation we worked with. It was a practical pile of paper that smelled faintly of printer ink and second chances. "It's not a Pyrrhic apology," he said. "I can't undo the weeks you lived in that peculiar kind of exposure. But I'm trying to change the structures that made it possible. If you want someone in your life, it has to be someone who can hold accountability and change on their sleeve." It was not a man asking for absolution. It was a man offering evidence, steps, structures, a willingness to be monitored. For the first time since the note tucked in my mailbox, I felt the conversation move from private hurt into public reckoning. We did not kiss in that conference room. We did not speak in the language of passion or immediate reunion. Instead, we allocated trust in the same way we'd learned to allocate grant funding, in small, monitored increments. I asked for guarantees that the foundation's independence would be legally robust. He agreed. I asked for assurances that he would not use my name to forward corporate deals. He wrote them into the documents. I asked that he not contact me outside formal channels while we established these boundaries. He respected that. The repair was not instantaneous. It was a season of watchfulness. Him appearing in community meetings as a donor who kept his voice measured and quiet. Me testing whether his presence in the room caused the volunteers to shrink or to swell with possibility. Slowly, predictably, the scandal mill lost interest. People moved on as people do. We became, for a time, less interesting to strangers, and that was a gift. In the meantime, the foundation grew. Our reading program expanded to 2 more neighborhoods. We partnered with a small press to publish the stories of participants. We created a monthly reading hour where adults who had never seen a book choose a chapter and read aloud in a room that smelled like hot chocolate and possibility. One afternoon, a young man named Marco told me he'd read the word commitment for the first time in a book we provided. His voice cracked on the syllables in a way that made everyone in the room remember what promises felt like. Those immediate, unglamorous returns were my currency. They were the way the heartbreak transformed into something steadier. Months later, after we had worked through governance details and I had seen the foundation sponsoring projects with board oversight that included community representatives, Jake asked me if I would consider partnering more formally. Co-designing programs, perhaps teaching a series on narrative and resilience. He asked gently, as one asks for consent, and not with the old coercive charm that treats access like a favor. I said yes, but on terms I said. I wanted transparency, co-authorship credits, and a seat at the steering committee where decisions about funding and public messaging would be made. He agreed, and we wrote those terms into the memorandum, like 2 people who had been clumsy with each other's hearts but were learning to be careful. The months after that were practical and intimate in a new way. He rode a subway once with me to observe a reading hour. He huffed at the stale heat, but smiled when a girl asked whether he liked the story. He attended a donor meeting where he remained quiet while others spoke.
It astonished me how small, ordinary things could be enough to rebuild trust. He learned people's names and remembered them. I learned that asking for structure made my footing stronger. Love, in the reconfigured version of us, was less about rescue and more about partnership. It was about negotiating a life that allowed both of us agency and mandates. It involved him acknowledging that his absence had been both protective and selfish. It involved me acknowledging that I had wanted, sometimes desperately, to be validated. It involved long, honest conversations about power and the responsibilities that came with it. Our relationship did not re-enter the public stage with fireworks. There was no dramatic press release. Instead, there were small public acts that mattered to people we worked with. A joint announcement of a reading grant with community leaders on the dais. A pilot program underwritten by a fund that had independent trustees. A summer literacy fair where Jake, wearing a volunteer badge, helped children stamp their names into bookmarks. Those gestures mattered because they were visible in the right way, not as spectacle, but as service. Then came the real test, the kind of moment that reveals whether change is cosmetic or foundational. A new investor campaigned within Bennett & Co. for a return to riskier practices, arguing that the company's philanthropic engagement distracted from earnings. The boardroom frayed. Some executives proposed a more transactional model that would use stories like marketing collateral. I watched the replay of our old errors, the way narratives can be weaponized to distract or to humanize for profit. This time, Jake did something different. He stood up at the board meeting and, with a voice that bore the fatigue of many sleepless nights, he argued for an ethical firewall between marketing and our philanthropic partners. He proposed that any storytelling must be approved by an independent community board, that donors' names would not be used to manipulate public sentiment, and that any decision affecting the foundation would require a unanimous vote with at least 2 community representatives present. He risked his position for a principle. It was a blow to certain shareholders. A stock dip followed. People called him naive or worse. But it was also the kind of risk that costs something and therefore counts as genuine. I watched the news cycle and felt the old hollow in my ribs. Then a different thing happened. The policy passed. It was not unanimous, but it was enough. It had teeth. It was structural. That night, he texted me 3 photograph thumbnails. Our reading room with new shelves, a child holding a stamped bookmark, and a close-up of the new governance charter. The final message read, "I keep breaking and fixing in equal measures. I'm sorry for the breaking. I'm trying to fix the rest." When we met after that, the air between us felt like the space after rain, cleaned and raw. We talked until the cafe closed and the barista turned on the lamps and asked for last orders. He was less polished and more present. His hands, which once seemed to perform kindness for cameras, were now the hands of someone who had learned to sit with consequence. There was humility in them. There was also an apology that had weight because it had been followed by change. We did not rush into public declarations. Instead, we rebuilt a private life. Dinner in his modest kitchen where we cooked terribly together, quiet weekends at a small cabin where the ocean hissed in the distance, and long nights reading beside a lamp. He taught me to play a clumsy piece on the piano. I taught him how to make a proper French press. We learned each other's small vulnerabilities. The irrational fear of elevators, the childhood habit of folding receipts into neat squares. Time does peculiar things to grief. It doesn't dissolve it, it layers it with new textures. Trust rebuilt, boundaries established, kindness chosen daily. The heartbreak that had once felt like a permanent fracture took on a different shape. It did not vanish. It lived beside us like a scar that reminded us both of past mistakes and future commitments. The wedding did not come suddenly. It arrived as a quiet project that took shape over years of incremental trust. We chose to have it at a small community garden rather than a hotel ballroom.
an intentional flip from the scene where my humiliation had been loudest. Our guest list contained the volunteers who had helped build the reading program, the kids who had learned to read under our roofs, friends who had stayed when headlines had not been kind, and family members who had mended in smaller, steady ways. Lauren did not attend. There was no dramatic confrontation. Hers was a silent absence that felt like a closed chapter and nothing more. My mother attended, older and softer, and at one point caught my eye and mouthed something like, "proud." There were no silk gowns or magazine photographers. There was a single quartet, an ensemble whose bows I now recognized from the hotel night years earlier, and the same slow, forgiving waltz that had first given me the sense of being seen. I walked down a small aisle between potted herbs and folding chairs, my book pendant resting against my collarbone like a lived memory. He stood waiting, not like the public figure from magazines, but as the man who had learned how to struggle with his best and worst sides. We read vows we had written in long, careful evenings, promises that focused not on rescue, but on partnership, accountability, and the labor of kindness. "I promise to listen," he said, and the words were not theatrical, only true. "I promise to keep structures in place that make it possible for us to be good to each other and to the people who have trusted us with their stories." "I promise," I replied, "to keep my life steady whether you're beside me or not. I promise to ask for exactly what I need and to offer you the same." The crowd was small and honest. Some people wiped their faces with napkins because grief and joy are close cousins. After the vows, we did what newlyweds often do. We stood awkwardly while people threw confetti that looked like shredded book pages. It was fitting. When we danced, the quartet played a soft number, and for a moment the world contracted to the smooth of his hand and the warmth at the base of my throat. The memory of the hotel waltz arrived not as a ghost, but as a proof. A hinge that had opened and closed and finally, slowly aligned. We did not pretend that everything had been fixed by the ceremony. There were and will always be complexities that a wedding does not erase. Lingering resentments, corporate obligations, the way public life sometimes reshapes private hours. But there was a framework now. Transparency and shared responsibility, structures that made it harder for private lives to be rewritten into marketing narratives without consent. In the years that followed, the literacy program grew into a network of community centers. I sat on panels and spoke about the politics of storytelling. Jake occasionally stood in the back and watched, and sometimes he introduced me at events with a line that had learned to be neither performative nor possessive. "This is Emily Hart. She does the work." It was a sentence that placed agency where it belonged. We married in a small ceremony that had none of the ostentation of the hotel wedding and all the warmth of a kitchen table conversation. We kept a photograph from that first lantern-lit night in a frame on our shared desk. Soft evidence that tenderness had found its way into something steadier. The torn invitation remained, too, under glass. The brittle edges were a reminder of the cruelty that had been aimed at me and the way it had been resisted, then repaired. Sometimes, late at night, I take the book pendant off and roll it between my fingers. It still carries the faintest scratch from a bicycle chain from when I was 20 and determined to be both practical and impossibly romantic. It reminds me of a truth I learned the hard way. Being seen is not always a gift. Sometimes being seen comes with price. But you can change the accounting. You can insist on structures that protect people, you can choose to be accountable, and you can turn heartbreak into a curriculum for how not to hurt others. A dance with a CEO had changed everything. First by making me visible in a way that opened me to cruelty, then by bringing me into a set of choices that required me to be brave and exact. The heartbreak was the hinge that taught me to build a life that didn't rely solely on being chosen. It taught me how to choose back. If this story found you in a place where you feel small or erased, know this: small acts accumulate. Showing up to a room, teaching a child a word, saying no when necessary, Those are the ways we reclaim our narratives. If you love true-to-life love stories and second chances, subscribe for more narratives like this one. Years later, in the quiet of our home office, framed on the wall above our shared desk, sits a photograph from the community center. Children with new books and wide, astonished faces. Next to it, the lantern photograph of the two of us. Beside that, the torn invitation, glassed and steady. They hang together, evidence that kindness and consequence can coexist, that heartbreak can become a teacher, that a simple dance can begin a long, complicated, ultimately hopeful story. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that being seen is not the end of the story. And if you want more stories about kindness, accountability, and slow, honest love, subscribe and join our community. More second chances are waiting.